Welcome, everyone. I'd like to introduce Stephen Aldrich, who is our next speaker. Stephen is a senior information security specialist at St. Charles Health System in Central Oregon. With experience in SOC analysis, incident response, and network security, he holds CISSP, CEH, and OSCP certifications and enjoys offensive security and CTFs. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everybody for joining me today. Learn a little bit more about ATT&CK. Hope you're all enjoying the summit. So how many people here can tell me or know about ATT&CK? I've heard of MITRE ATT&CK before. And how many people have looked at it and said, wow, this is really cool, but what do I do with it? Exactly, right? I was there too. So hopefully we're going to get a little more information to you so you guys can use it to operationalize your security in your organization. So that's me. We already had an introduction. I'm not going to bore you with anything more of mine. We're going to jump right in. So before we jump into MITRE ATT&CK, I want to go over a couple of concepts that are going to help us understand why MITRE ATT&CK is important. So the first one's going to be the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. So this was originally developed from the military kill chain for the cyber world by Lockheed Martin in 2011. It demonstrates the steps that adversaries take during an attack, from reconnaissance up until action on objectives. I have the right thing up there, right? Yeah, okay. The important thing to take away from this is that each one of these steps is going to give us an opportunity to either put in a detection or a mitigation to actually stop the attacker, forcing them to go back previous steps. The next one I'm going to talk about is David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. So as defenders, we use indicators to detect the presence of adversaries within our environment. The faster we can respond, the sooner we can eliminate the adversary and hopefully reduce the damage. Some indicators are going to be more valuable than others. This pyramid demonstrates the relationship between the indicators that we as defenders use to detect adversaries and the amount of pain it causes the adversaries when we deny them the use of these detections. So progressing up the pyramid, each level is going to draw from a smaller pool of options for the adversary, forcing them to use additional resources to overcome and making it more difficult for them. So at the bottom of the pyramid are file hashes. So this is something that's going to be like an antivirus software to detect a malicious file. Now these are really good at detecting malicious files, but it's only going to detect one malicious file. And it's trivial for adversaries to change the hash of that file and still be able to use their malware, making them very brittle. At the top of the pyramid are TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are the actual adversary behaviors, and these are going to be the most valuable indicators for us as defenders. So if we take the example of an adversary using a tool to dump credentials from LSAS, we can certainly put in a detection for that tool. The adversaries are going to be able to switch to a different tool because that detection is only going to work for one tool. If instead, we put in a detection for the dumping of credentials from LSAS, we can detect that behavior no matter the tool they use. They have to relearn that behavior, and they have to find another way to get the credentials to actually escalate privileges. And this is where ATT&CK lives, making it the most valuable of our indicators. So what is MITRE ATT&CK? So MITRE is a non-for-profit organization founded in 1958, currently running several federally funded research and development centers, one in cybersecurity. FFRDCs are designed to help government and private industry better communicate on complex problems. And because of this, FFRDCs are not allowed to compete with private industry. And in the case of MITRE, they actually make all their research available for free in that case. So ATT&CK was just developed in 2011 as a way to, out of a project that was designed for adversary emulation. It was actually designed to improve communication between red teams by categorizing adversarial behaviors. It is defined on its website as a globally accessible knowledge base based on real-world globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world scenarios, meaning it's based on actual adversary behaviors. It doesn't take into account things like that are done in research labs or POCs that are not actually out in the wild. So ATT&CK stands for Adversary Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. This is the enterprise matrix that's seen on the website. At the top of the matrix are 14 tactics running left to right across the top. These are actually high-level goals of the adversary at a certain stage during attack. So we're talking about things like initial access, privilege escalation, lateral movement. Under each tactic are going to be techniques. This is how the adversary is going to accomplish those goals. Some techniques are going to have sub-techniques, which are just going to be more specialized techniques, more specialized implementation of that technique. There's currently 201 techniques and 424 sub-techniques within the framework. So we want to take a little closer look at how this kind of all fits together. If we want to understand how an adversary gets initial access on a system, we can look at the initial foothold on a system. We can look at the initial access page. So this is going to give us a description of what this is. It's also going to give us a list of techniques the adversary may use to accomplish those goals. If we want to further explore the phishing technique, we can click into that, and we can see that the phishing technique actually has several sub-techniques that you can use to get in there. We can further explore the spear phishing attachment technique. And again, we're going to get a description. And in this case, we're going to get actual examples of procedures adversaries used to actually accomplish this technique. Along with the description, we're also going to get a reference to an article where that information actually came from. And these are the details that we can actually use to start improving our defenses. So how are we going to do that? So if we use a model of continuous improvement, ATT&CK can help us develop what's called a threat-informed defense, defined by MITRE. It's applying a deep understanding of adversary tradecraft and technology to protect against, detect, and mitigate cyber attacks. We've already talked about threat intelligence to identify the behaviors in the form of TTPs. The next step is to actually build detections or mitigations that we can use when the adversaries enter the environment. Once we have those built, how do we know they're working? Well, we could wait for an adversary to come into the environment and test them for us, or we could actually be proactive about them and use a process called adversary emulation to test those and verify that they're working. And finally, we're going to have a lot of information of what works in the environment and what needs improvement that we can actually take back and start using to better our defenses. Let's go into a little more detail in each one now. So as I said, the journey of attack begins with threat intelligence, by understanding adversary behaviors. If you're new to attack, the easiest way to get started is to use the threat intelligence that already exists within the framework. This will allow you to get a better understanding of how adversary behaviors interact with the TTPs and help you more for when you're actually mapping on your own later. ATT&CK is highly searchable, so here you can search for your organization's vertical. Here I search for healthcare, and you get numerous adversaries to get started with. It's also possible to look up specific adversaries or software that you may be interested in. Black Boss has been in the news lately. Perhaps you'd want to take a look. You can search in there, and you can see that yes, they're within the matrix, so you can actually get more information on them. So as you begin to become more comfortable with the framework, you can actually start taking articles written by groups like CISA or Talos to gain additional threat intelligence. Nowadays, a lot of these articles are already mapping to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So while you go through and make your notes, you can compare what other researchers wrote down and actually start improving your skills. And it also might be a good idea to start mapping your incidents to MITRE ATT&CK to help you actually improve your incident response planning. So taking a look at the Black Bosta page, we can see we get a brief description. It tells us that it operates as a ransomware as a service. meaning the affiliates can use the infrastructure and support services of Black Basta in exchange for payment, percentage of the payment that they get from a ransomware attack. We're also going to see that it lists various techniques for Black Basta. Again, you're going to get a little description as well as a reference to an article where that information came from. And you also see there's a button there called the Attack Navigator layer. We can download this, and it'll actually give us a visual representation of what these techniques look like, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. So now let's look at how we can use this threat intelligence to actually start improving our defenses. So one of the techniques used by Black Basta is command scripting interpreter with a sub-technique of Windows command shell. And you can see here that they use this technique to disable and delete shadow copies on a system. If we take a closer look at the article, which was written by Deep Instinct, it tells us they discovered code within the malware that actually shows the commands actually issued to make this happen. This is going to be actionable threat intelligence, right? You generally don't want to see this run on any of your systems. And if you do, it's probably a sign of bad things to come. So we can now take this information, look into our security tools, and see if we have a mitigation or a detection for this, and see and mark it down. Then we're going to continue this process for all of the techniques for the Black Basta adversary, noting where we have coverage and where we need improvement. So how are we going to track all this? So we certainly put it in a spreadsheet. But additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we can download the Navigator attack layer, which actually gives us a visual representation of what these techniques look like. Right now, it just highlights the cells for the techniques listed on the previous page. These cells are also going to contain the notes that were for each technique, as well as the URL to the reference. And you can add your own notes as well, so it makes a pretty handy reference. So like I said, we're going to go through and we're going to note our findings. Yes, we have a detection. No, we don't. Maybe we're not sure. And we can create a heat map that looks like this. This is going to tell us the coverage that we have for the adversary and demonstrate our strong and weak points, and moving us in the direction of helping improve our defenses. For demonstration here, I chose 3 categories for the detections: low, medium, high confidence. You can certainly do whatever you want, but I'd suggest starting simple until you understand the process. It's always easier to add later than it is to put in now. And while we're at it, talking about coverage detection, the goal here is not to get everything to green, okay? You're probably never going to get 100%. And if you try to do it, you're probably going to frustrate yourself. If you think back to the cyber kill chain, each one of these cells is an opportunity for us to detect or mitigate the adversary coming in, slowing him down, causing him pain and frustration, allowing us to get ahead of him. We just need to get enough that we can keep track of them. That brings us to adversary emulation. So with the complexity of information systems and the sophistication of today's adversaries, we can no longer just trust that simply something works, right? We need to verify it, and we need to verify it repeatedly. What works today may not work tomorrow. We're always introducing new tools, there's new adversaries, things break, configurations change. So by running these emulations, when our environment changes, new tools are implemented, or new adversaries are discovered, we can provide a continuous validation of our controls. In short, the emulation gives us the ability to test our tools before the adversaries test them for us, right? So to do this, we're going to take a system, we're going to install all of our standard security tools on that system, and then we're going to run commands that actually mimic adversary behavior. This is going to tell us whether or not our tools are tuned properly. Different types of emulations we can do are, we have atomics. So this is going to mimic, this is a simple command that's going to mimic one adversary technique. Let's say we built a new detection and we want to test it, right? Microemulations are going to mimic chain techniques. For example, if we wanted to see how an adversary uses privilege escalation to move through the environment, we might want to trace that with a microemulation. And then finally, full emulations are exactly what they sound like. They're going to emulate the full attack chain of the adversary. So you can certainly do this manually, but it's recommended that you use a tool that catalogs and maps to the MITRE attack framework. Both Red Canary's Atomic Red Team and MITRE's Caldera are open source projects, free open source projects that map to the ATT&CK framework. So these might be a good way to get started if you're just getting your program going and you don't necessarily have the resources to go out and buy any of these fancy commercial tools that actually do the same thing. And finally, you can actually use adversary emulation for incident response. So using a combination of adversary behaviors and TTPs, we can actually build out realistic tabletop exercises to specific adversaries and run our teams through them to see how we do. From there, we can use the results to build out playbooks that can help us with things like threat hunting, being able to figure out which adversary we're actually up against, and we can trace them through the environment. And we can even list detections we could put in place during an incident that we may not want to have in place under normal circumstances because it creates so much noise as to be not be very useful. So finally, ready to assess our findings so we can ultimately improve our defenses. So remember, this is going to be an iterative process. Don't try and solve all the problems at once because it's going to become overwhelming. Concentrate on the highest risks you discovered for your organization. Perhaps in the previous steps, you mapped out the top 5 ransomware groups for your sector. Now you can take those maps, overlay them, and identify the largest gaps in coverage. Then you can determine if there's an event source you can add, that you can add, or maybe there's data that you have that's not being properly ingested into your security tools. If you need a tool, you're now going to have the information to show you exactly what you need to get, and you're going to have the ability to vet that tool before purchasing it. You're also going to have the data to show the risk, so that when you go to management to ask for the money, they're going to understand why you want it. And if you're really lucky, you might find that you have redundant tools, and you can phase something out and actually save the organization money. And if you need additional help, MITRE also has mitigations and detections for each technique. These are down at the bottom of the page, and there's lots of references to those as ways different things you can do to actually help there. And then finally, we're going to go back to the beginning, remapping threat actors, testing our defenses, and validating that the expected gaps have been filled, and identifying ways to further improve our defenses. Okay, so as I wrap up, again, I want to thank you for joining me to learn a little bit more about MITRE ATT&CK, and I hope I was able to give you enough information to at least pique your interest into learning a little bit more about how you can use it to help your organization improve your defenses. But keep in mind that the attack framework is only, what you can use the attack framework is only limited to your imagination, right? Don't think that this is the only stuff you can use it for. And don't think you have to use it for all of this, right? The only thing I'd say is if you do discover something new, a new novel way to use this, please share it with everyone, right? Because that's why we're here, right? To share information. None of us have all the pieces to the puzzle. And be sure that if we all work together, we can actually defeat the adversaries. And last thing I want to say is, for those of you that don't work in a SOC, don't think that this is just a tool for the SOC, okay? As I mentioned in the beginning, it was originally created to improve communication between red and blue teams. And I think that applies to everyone, right? If you're reading a white paper and you come across a technique that you don't understand, go ahead and go to the attack framework and look it up. Generally, you're going to get what you need in the first couple of sentences. And if you want to keep digging, go for it. If not, go back to the article knowing that you actually learned something and you have a better understanding of what they're talking about in the article. And that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
This question, I just wanted to double check. Back on the heat map, you said it's not the goal to turn everything to green. That makes sense. I want to be sure I understand what the goal is. Is the goal to cover enough indicators that you know when you are being attacked in that particular way? Or is there a different balance?
Yes, that's what you're trying to do. So basically the idea is, if we look back to the cyber kill chain, you think of each one of those cells as a way to detect the adversaries in the environment. You don't need to get them all, but you do want to have enough that you can trace them through, right? The problem you're going to run into trying to get them all green is that some of them you just can't put a detection in for. It's just a behavior that the adversary uses, right? If the adversary is on a system doing, for example, discovery, it's going to look like traffic, or it's going to look like stuff within your environment, right? We all have admins that go through and run these commands all day. Does that make sense?
Hi there. For a small, maybe infrastructure team or a small sysadmin team, the navigator and the framework as a whole is really flexible and can be applied to a lot of things, but that also makes it more intimidating to get started. How would you recommend a smaller team start with the MITRE and ATT&CK framework?
I would suggest you pick an adversary directly from the framework that exists there, so you don't have to map anything on your own. Just read about it, and then look at what the techniques are, and see if you can compare them to your techniques. A lot of security tools these days are already mapping to the framework. It's not super easy, but it's way easier than it would be to say, like, have to go in and like dissect how things are working. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.